The war in Europe was over. The Third Reich, a nightmare that had consumed the continent for 12 long years, had finally crumbled into dust and rubble. Berlin, once the heart of a fearsome empire, was now a ghost city. Its streets choked with the debris of a fallen ideology. For millions of German soldiers scattered across the continent, the fight was finished. Surrender wasn't a choice. It was the only reality left. But even in these final, chaotic days, the war offered up its last secrets, its last human dramas. Among the very last to be captured were 37 German women, taken by British forces as the final pockets of resistance collapsed. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense, but they were products of the same machine, raised on a diet of fear and fanaticism. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted a terrifying portrait of the enemy. The British, they were told, were not just soldiers, they were monsters. Goebbels's films and posters depicted them as cruel, degenerate brutes waiting to inflict unspeakable horrors upon any German who fell into their hands. These 37 women had grown up believing this with every fiber of their being. They had been taught that capture meant torture, that surrender meant slavery, and that falling into Allied hands was a fate far worse than a quick death on the battlefield. This wasn't just a story they'd heard. It was the foundation of their worldview, the lens through which they saw the enemy. To them, the British uniform was a symbol of pure, unadulterated evil. So, as they were marched away from the ruins of their homeland, a deep, chilling dread set in. Their journey took them north, through a scarred and broken Germany, across the Channel, and into the green heart of England itself, towards a prisoner-of-war camp in Lancashire. Each step was heavy with fear. With every mile that passed, the propaganda they had absorbed for years echoed in their minds. Whispers passed nervously between them, a frantic exchange of their darkest fears. They spoke of interrogation cells, of brutal retribution. "They will make us pay for everything," one might have murmured. "This is where we die," another might have thought. They envisioned beatings, starvation, and a slow, agonizing end. They were the enemy, the defeated, and they were now completely at the mercy of the monsters they had been warned about their entire lives. They braced themselves for the nightmare to begin. When the trucks finally ground to a halt at the gates of the camp, they were exhausted, filthy, and terrified. But they were also defiant. They were the children of the Reich, and they would face their end with their heads held high. They were herded out of the trucks, their eyes scanning the strange, foreign landscape, searching for the instruments of torture, for the faces of their tormentors. They stood in a tense, silent line, a small group of vanquished women surrounded by victorious men, waiting for the first blow to fall. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and then something happened that none of them could have ever predicted. It was a moment so small, so simple, yet so profoundly world-shattering that it would change everything. A British sergeant, a man with a weathered face and a tired but steady gaze, stepped forward from the line of guards. He looked not at a group of hated enemies, but at a line of exhausted, frightened young women. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply cleared his throat, looked one of them in the eye, and asked a question that made no sense in their universe of hatred and violence. He asked, "Timus?" Timus. 4 simple words. In that single, quiet moment, the entire edifice of Nazi propaganda, the years of carefully constructed fear, the certainty of their own impending doom, it all just cracked. It was a gesture of basic human decency. So unexpected, so completely at odds with the monstrous image they held of their captors. It was more disorienting than any act of cruelty could have been. How could a monster offer you a cup of tea? It was a question that had no answer in the world they came from. In the quiet steam rising from a porcelain cup, these women were about to discover that the enemy had a human face. And this was only the beginning of their story. The camp in Lancashire was called Grisdale Hall, but it would become known by another name, the U-boat Hotel. And what happened inside its walls was one of the most remarkable and little-known stories of the entire war. The 37 women who arrived expecting a death sentence were about to begin a very different kind of journey, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, humanity, and themselves. The woman who was offered that first cup of tea was named Hannah. She was just 21 years old, a fervent believer who had served in the female auxiliary of the German armed forces. Like the others, she had been thoroughly indoctrinated. She saw the British soldiers not as men, but as Tommies. The caricatured, brutish enemy from the posters. To be offered a kindness by one of them felt like a trick, a psychological trap. She hesitated, her mind racing. Was this a prelude to something worse? A way to soften them up before the real interrogation began? She eyed the sergeant suspiciously, but his expression was plain, unreadable. He simply held the steaming mug, waiting. Reluctantly, almost defiantly, she took it. The warmth spread through her cold hands, a simple, physical sensation that stood in stark contrast to the cold fear in her heart. As Hannah and the other women were led into the camp, they saw that this wasn't the grim gulag they had imagined. Grisdale Hall was a large country manor, requisitioned for the war. It was old and a bit run down, but it was set amidst the stunning, rolling hills of the English Lake District. Instead of barbed wire and guard towers, they saw manicured lawns and ancient trees. This wasn't a place of punishment. It looked more like a boarding school. Their bewilderment grew. They were assigned 2 dormitories with actual beds, given clean clothes, and provided with regular meals. The food was simple, British fare porridge, stews, bread, and jambut. It was plentiful. There were no shackles, no cells, no daily beatings. The guards were firm but professional, treating them with a detached courtesy that was more unsettling than outright hostility. The man in charge of this unusual camp was a British intelligence officer named Colonel Alexander Scotland. He was a veteran of 2 world wars, a shrewd, unconventional man who understood that information was a far more valuable weapon than fear. He had a radical idea. He believed that the fastest way to break down the ideological armor of these prisoners wasn't through force, but through something far more subversive: kindness. His plan was to create an environment so contrary to Nazi propaganda that the prisoners' entire belief system would begin to unravel on its own. He wasn't interested in punishing them. He was interested in understanding them and in turning them. He wanted to deprogram them, to show them that the world outside the Third Reich wasn't the monster they'd been taught to fear. This tea and sympathy approach, as some called it, was a bold and controversial experiment. For the first few weeks, the German women remained suspicious and hostile. They stuck together, speaking only German, singing patriotic songs, and refusing to cooperate beyond the bare minimum. They saw the good treatment as a sophisticated form of psychological warfare. They were still prisoners, still enemies, but slowly, inevitably, the cracks began to widen. It is hard to maintain a state of defiant hatred when your captor brings you a book to read, or when a guard teaches you a few words of English with a friendly smile. The daily routine of civilized life began to work its subtle magic. They were given tasks working in the kitchens, tending the gardens, mending clothes. This work wasn't forced labor. It was a way to pass the time, to create a sense of normalcy. And as they worked alongside the British staff, they began to see them not as monstrous caricatures, but as ordinary people. They saw the cook complain about the rationing. They got in a fret about his roses. The guards share jokes and talk about their families back home. These small, human moments were like drops of water on a stone, slowly eroding the years of indoctrination. They began to question what they had been told. If the British were so evil, why were they being treated so well? If the Allied cause was so degenerate, why did these people seem so decent? The U-boat hotel was not a prison for their bodies, but for their minds. And Colonel Scotland's experiment was beginning to work in ways no one could have anticipated. The war of weapons was over, but here, in the quiet hills of Lancashire, a new, more personal battle had just begun. A battle for the soul. Summer 1945. While much of Europe was still reeling from the scars of war, grappling with vengeance and retribution, Britain made a decision. It was a choice that would echo through history, a strategic directive that seemed almost counterintuitive. In March of that year, the War Office issued a clear and powerful statement: prisoners are soldiers, not slaves. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a command. It meant that the British Army would rigidly adhere to the Geneva Convention of 1929. Even in the shadows, even when no one was watching, there would be no beatings. No starvation, no acts of revenge. Now, You might think this sounds soft, perhaps even naive, given the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. But this was anything but weakness. It was a calculated, brilliant strategy. British psychologists and intelligence officers had developed a groundbreaking theory. The goal wasn't just to contain the prisoners, it was to dismantle the very foundation of their beliefs. And so, a quiet, psychological war began, not on the battlefield, but within the minds of the captured. The setting for this experiment was a prisoner of war camp in Lancashire. Imagine the scene. Captured German soldiers, women among them, arriving defeated and indoctrinated, expecting the worst. They had been taught that the British were monsters, decadent and cruel. They were prepared for brutality, for the same inhumane treatment their own regime had perfected. But what they found was utterly disorienting. Instead of rags, they were given clean uniforms. Instead of being screamed at or dehumanized, they were addressed politely. The food, while rationed like everyone else's in Britain, was sufficient and wholesome. This wasn't a holiday camp, but the basic dignities afforded to them were a form of psychological shock. The British guards, many of whom had lost family and friends in the war, were tasked with an incredibly difficult job to be patient, to be professional, and to teach English to their former enemies. Think about the mental discipline that required to look at the uniform of the person who, just weeks before, was your mortal enemy, and to offer them a lesson in grammar instead of a fist. These were small acts, but their impact was immense. A guard placing a lantern outside the prisoner's barracks during a blackout drill, a gesture of safety and concern. These simple gestures of humanity struck harder and deeper than any propaganda leaflet ever could. They didn't need to shout about the evils of Nazism. They demonstrated a better way through their actions. Each act of kindness, no matter how small, created a tiny fracture in the prisoner's indoctrinated belief system. It was like a constant, gentle pressure on a sheet of glass, until eventually cracks began to appear. The reality they were experiencing was in direct contradiction to everything they had been taught. We can see the profound effect of this strategy in the personal diaries kept by some of the female prisoners of war. Their words are a testament to the confusion and a dawning realization. One woman wrote, "I do not understand why they are kind when they could be cruel." This simple question reveals a mind in turmoil. The enemy was not behaving as an enemy should. Another diary entry reads, "How can we hate a people who give us soup and warmth?" The foundations of their hatred were crumbling, replaced by a bewildering sense of gratitude and respect. The British weren't just winning a war of arms, they were winning a war of ideas, proving that decency and humanity could be the most powerful weapons of all. This chapter of history is a powerful lesson in the art of psychological warfare, where the ultimate victory was not conquest, but conversion. It was the quiet triumph of the human spirit over a hateful ideology. One bowl of soup, one polite word, one act of kindness at a time. Picture this. It's early 1946. The war in Europe is over, but the silence that follows is heavy. Across the British countryside, something extraordinary is happening. Over 400,000 German prisoners of war, both men and women, are no longer just behind barbed wire. They're out in the fields, on the rail lines, and up on the rooftops. They are rebuilding the very nation they were sent to destroy. Every single day, these prisoners worked side by side with British civilians. They weren't just clearing rubble or harvesting crops. They were interacting, sharing tools, and perhaps a quiet word. And in those moments, a powerful realization began to dawn on both sides. The British civilians they worked with were not the villains of propaganda. They were just people who were grieving their own losses, struggling with strict rationing, and missing loved ones who would never return. The lines between enemy and captor, victor and vanquished, began to blur. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they were becoming neighbors. But it wasn't just about shared labor. It was about shared humanity, and nothing brought that into sharper focus than Christmas of 1946. This was a moment that would change everything. Across the country, something unthinkable just a year before started happening. British families began opening their doors and inviting German prisoners of war into their homes for Christmas dinner. Imagine being one of those prisoners. For years, you've known only the harsh realities of war and captivity. And now, you're sitting at a family table, surrounded by the warmth of a fireplace, the sound of laughter, and the smell of a home-cooked meal. For many of them, it was the first time in years they had experienced anything close to normal life. It was more than just a meal. It was a gesture of profound kindness, a crack of light in a world that had been dark for so long. And for the women among these prisoners, this experience sparked a revelation that was both horrifying and deeply hopeful. As they sat in these warm, welcoming homes, a thought crystallized. They were safer here, in the land of their former enemy, than they were in the homeland that had raised them. Think about what Germany was in 1947. It was a wasteland. Cities were flattened into seas of rubble. There were no jobs, barely any food. The entire society was grappling with a colossal weight of guilt and shame, stained by the horrors of genocide. The very idea of home had been shattered. The familiar streets were gone. The social fabric was torn, and the ideology they had been raised on had been exposed as a monstrous lie. Home no longer felt like home. One prisoner captured this feeling perfectly in a letter. He wrote, "We arrived expecting death. Instead, we were given life." This wasn't just a poetic turn of phrase. It was a literal truth for thousands. Britain, the country they were taught to hate, was offering them a future when their own country offered none. It was offering them a chance to live, to work, to simply be. This realization led to a quiet but determined movement. More and more German prisoners began signing petitions, officially requesting to remain in Britain permanently. They weren't asking for handouts. They were asking for a chance to contribute. And they took on jobs in hospitals, tending to the sick. They worked on farms, helping to feed the nation. They operated looms and textile mills, weaving the fabric of a new post-war society. It's an incredible irony, isn't it? These individuals, who had been sent as soldiers to conquer and destroy, were now voluntarily staying to rebuild and heal. They were quietly and diligently helping to reconstruct the very nation they had once fought against. It's a testament to the power of human connection to overcome even the deepest divisions of war. They weren't just rebuilding buildings and infrastructure. They were rebuilding trust, community, and hope itself. Their story is a powerful reminder that even after the darkest of conflicts, shared humanity can find a way to build a new and better world. The year is 1948. The war, a nightmare that consumed the world, is finally over. Across Britain, in camps that once held enemies, an announcement echoes: repatriation. The long journey home. Trains are waiting at the stations, their steam billowing like ghosts of the past. Boats are ready in the harbors, prepared to cross the channel. Papers are being signed, the final bureaucratic step to close a dark chapter. The war is over, and it's time for the German prisoners of war to go back to Germany. But then, something remarkable happens, something that history books often forget to mention. When the roll is called, when names are read out one by one, there is silence. Thousands of German posts refuse to leave. They choose to stay. And it's not just the men. Among them are the women. Remember those 37 women from the medical corps we talked about earlier? The ones who arrived on British soil as prisoners? Many of them are on this list of those who refused to go back. They'd seen enough of the old world. They wanted a new one. Why? Why would they choose to remain in the country that was once their enemy? The answer is simple, yet profound. They had found something here they thought they had lost forever. A future. During their time in captivity, they weren't just prisoners. They were people. They worked on farms, side by side with British locals. They shared stories, meals, and laughter. The barriers of language and uniform began to crumble, replaced by the simple, universal language of human connection. Many of these women fell in love. They married British men farmers, factory workers, soldiers they had once faced across a battlefield. They became British citizens, permanent residents of the island nation that had captured them. They traded their German surnames for English ones and started new families. They had children with bright eyes and local accents, who would grow up playing in British fields, blissfully unaware of the brutal war their mothers had survived. These children would never know the Germany their mothers had left behind, only the Britain that had welcomed them. Think about that transformation. These women, and the men who stayed with them, arrived as the enemy. They were seen as cogs in a hateful machine, weapons of a collapsing, destructive empire. They were the face of a conflict that had cost millions of lives and scarred the globe, but they didn't leave as enemies. They stayed as something entirely different. They became our neighbors, living just down the road. They became our colleagues, working in our factories and fields. They became mothers, raising a new generation of Britons. In the end, they simply became British. This isn't just a story about the end of a war. It's a story about the beginning of peace. A real, lasting peace built not on treaties or political agreements, but on individual acts of kindness and understanding. The British government and, more importantly, the British people made a choice. They could have chosen retribution. They could have chosen to treat their prisoners with the same cruelty they had seen from the enemy. Vengeance would have been easy. It would have been, for many, understandable. But they chose a different path. They chose decency. Kindness achieved what violence and war never could. It didn't just defeat an army. It conquered the heart. It broke down the walls of hatred and suspicion, not with bombs, but with a shared cup of tea, a helping hand in the fields, a simple smile. It showed these prisoners that the people they were taught to hate were not monsters, but human beings, whose liked him. It was a quiet victory, one that wasn't celebrated with parades or medals, but it was perhaps the most important victory of all. Imagine the fear they must have felt when they first stepped onto British soil as prisoners. They walked into captivity, expecting the worst of humanity. They had been indoctrinated by a regime that glorified brutality and demonized its enemies. They probably believed the propaganda they'd been fed that the British were cruel, vengeful, and unforgiving. They braced themselves for punishment, for hardship, for a continuation of the horrors of war. But instead, in the most unexpected of places, they discovered the very best of humanity. They found compassion where they expected cruelty. They found acceptance where they expected rejection. This isn't to say that post-war Britain was a perfect utopia. The country was scarred, grieving, and exhausted. There were shortages, hardships, and lingering pockets of bitterness. It wasn't perfect, but in this crucial moment, Britain and its people made a collective choice. They chose decency over vengeance. They chose to see the person, not just the uniform, and in doing so, they didn't just rebuild their own nation. They helped thousands of former enemies rebuild their lives, creating a legacy of forgiveness and integration that resonates to this day. They came as prisoners, and they stayed as family. Their story is a powerful reminder that even after the darkest of conflicts, the human capacity for kindness can shine through heal wounds and build a new world from the ashes of the old. It is a testament to the idea that our shared humanity is always more powerful than the ideologies that seek to divide us.